Hello, and welcome to The Sleepy Evolutionist, where evolution meets relaxation. Tonight, we're drifting gently into the most profound story ever told, the entire 4 billion-year journey of how life began on our quiet little planet. It's a tale so vast and so beautiful that it spans the deepest reaches of time itself, connecting you, right here in this moment, to the very first spark of existence. Before we begin this cosmic journey together, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Perhaps you're settling into bed as darkness falls, or maybe you're finding solace in these early morning hours. Wherever you are, whenever you are, you're part of an unbroken chain that stretches back through 4 billion years of patient evolution. If you find this gentle exploration of deep time soothing, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed. It really helps this peaceful corner of the universe grow, where we can contemplate the magnificent story of life without the rush and noise of the everyday world. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake. But if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something truly profound along the way, that you are the universe becoming conscious of its own incredible journey from nothing to everything. This video is for educational and relaxation purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your breathing slow to match the patient rhythm of deep time itself. Close your eyes if you wish and prepare to drift backward through the vastest story ever told, the story of how empty space and simple chemistry somehow learned to dream, to think, to love, and eventually to become you. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was only heat and violence, ... In the beginning, there was only heat and violence. Let's drift gently back, all the way back, to a time so ancient that it seems almost mythical. 4.5 billion years ago, when our planet was nothing more than a molten ball of cosmic fury. Picture, if you will, the Earth as it was then, a world that would be utterly unrecognizable to your peaceful eyes tonight. The very ground beneath your comfortable bed was once liquid rock, glowing white-hot like the surface of a star. Imagine an ocean of molten stone, stretching endlessly in every direction, with temperatures reaching 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper, hot enough to turn any trace of water into instant steam. This was the Hadean Eon, named after Hades itself, and it was perhaps the most violent period in our planet's entire history. The Earth was still so young, so raw, that it barely knew how to be a planet at all. Giant asteroids, some the size of small mountains, crashed into the surface regularly, each impact releasing the energy of millions of nuclear bombs. Every collision sent fountains of molten rock shooting hundreds of kilometers into space, only to rain back down like liquid fire. The atmosphere, if you could call it that, was nothing like the gentle air you're breathing now. It was a toxic mixture of water vapor, hydrogen, methane, and ammonia, a poisonous fog that would kill you in seconds. There was no oxygen anywhere on Earth, none at all. The very gas that keeps you alive today simply didn't exist in our planet's early atmosphere. And yet, even in this hellish crucible, the building blocks of your existence were already being prepared. The same carbon atoms that now form your DNA were there, locked in simple molecules, waiting patiently through eons of cosmic violence. The hydrogen that helps form the water in your cells, that very hydrogen was already present, cycling through that ancient, toxic atmosphere. Think of it like this. Imagine the Earth as a vast cosmic kitchen, and this Hadean period was the time when all the ingredients for life were being slowly, carefully gathered together. The heat was so intense that complex molecules couldn't survive. But the simple elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, they were all there, waiting for the temperature to drop, just enough for chemistry to begin its patient work. Slowly, across millions upon millions of years, the bombardment of asteroids began to ease. The Earth's surface, still hot beyond imagination, began the incredibly gradual process of cooling. Steam rose continuously from the molten surface, filling the sky with water vapor that couldn't yet condense in the extreme heat. But time, deep time, is patient beyond human comprehension. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, degree by degree, the temperature began to fall. 400 million years passed, longer than complex life has existed on Earth, and still the surface remained molten. But the cosmic kitchen was cooling, and the ingredients for life were waiting. And here you are tonight, 4.5 billion years later, your body comfortably cool, breathing easily in an atmosphere that would seem like a miraculous paradise to that ancient, lifeless world. The carbon in your cells, the water in your blood, the very atoms that make up your thoughts, they all passed through that cosmic furnace. They survived the violence of planetary formation, just to become ... you. Your body still carries the memory of that ancient time. The way your cells process energy, the basic chemistry that keeps you alive, these are all techniques that were perfected in the shadow of that primordial violence. You are not separate from that ancient Earth. You are its direct descendant, its proudest achievement. Every peaceful breath you take tonight is made possible by 4 billion years of patient waiting, of chemistry slowly learning to organize itself, of a violent planet gradually becoming gentle enough to cradle life. As the Hadean Eon slowly came to an end, as the last of the great bombardment finally ceased, something beautiful was about to happen. The Earth was about to receive its first gift of water, and with that water would come the possibility of something that had never existed before anywhere in the universe that we know of, the possibility of life itself. The first rains were about to fall, ... In the beginning, there was only heat and violence. Let's drift gently back, all the way back, to a time so ancient that it seems almost mythical, 4.5 billion years ago, when our planet was nothing more than a molten ball of cosmic fury. Picture, if you will, the Earth as it was then, a world that would be utterly unrecognizable to your peaceful eyes tonight. The very ground beneath your comfortable bed was once liquid rock, glowing white-hot like the surface of a star. Imagine an ocean of molten stone, stretching endlessly in every direction, with temperatures reaching 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper, hot enough to turn any trace of water into instant steam. This was the Hadean Eon, named after Hades itself, and it was perhaps the most violent period in our planet's entire history. The Earth was still so young, so raw, that it barely knew how to be a planet at all. Giant asteroids, sun the size of small mountains, crashed into the surface regularly, each impact releasing the energy of millions of nuclear bombs. Every collision sent fountains of molten rock shooting hundreds of kilometers into space, only to rain back down like liquid fire. The atmosphere, if you could call it that, was nothing like the gentle air you're breathing now. It was a toxic mixture of water vapor, hydrogen, methane, and ammonia, a poisonous fog that would kill you in seconds. There was no oxygen anywhere on Earth, none at all. The very gas that keeps you alive today simply didn't exist in our planet's early atmosphere. And yet, even in this hellish crucible, the building blocks of your existence were already being prepared. The same carbon atoms that now form your DNA were there, locked in simple molecules, waiting patiently through eons of cosmic violence. The hydrogen that helps form the water in your cells, that very hydrogen was already present, cycling through that ancient, toxic atmosphere. Think of it like this. Imagine the Earth as a vast cosmic kitchen, and this Hadean period was the time when all the ingredients for life were being slowly, carefully gathered together. The heat was so intense that complex molecules couldn't survive, but the simple elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, they were all there, waiting for the temperature to drop, just enough for chemistry to begin its patient work. Slowly, across millions upon millions of years, the bombardment of asteroids began to ease. The Earth's surface, still hot beyond imagination, began the incredibly gradual process of cooling. Steam rose continuously from the molten surface, filling the sky with water vapor that couldn't yet condense in the extreme heat. But time, deep time, is patient beyond human comprehension. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, degree by degree, the temperature began to fall. 400 million years passed, longer than complex life has existed on Earth, and still the surface remained molten. But the cosmic kitchen was cooling, and the ingredients for life were waiting. And here you are tonight, 4.5 billion years later, your body comfortably cool, breathing easily in an atmosphere that would seem like a miraculous paradise to that ancient, lifeless world. The carbon in your cells, the water in your blood, the very atoms that make up your thoughts, they all pass through that cosmic furnace. They survived the violence of planetary formation, just to become ... you. Your body still carries the memory of that ancient time. The way your cells process energy, the basic chemistry that keeps you alive, these are all techniques that were perfected in the shadow of that primordial violence. You are not separate from that ancient Earth. You are its direct descendant, its proudest achievement. Every peaceful breath you take tonight is made possible by 4 billion years of patient waiting, of chemistry slowly learning to organize itself, of a violent planet gradually becoming gentle enough to cradle life. As the Hadean Eon slowly came to an end, as the last of the great bombardment finally ceased, something beautiful was about to happen. The Earth was about to receive its first gift of water, and with that water would come the possibility of something that had never existed before anywhere in the universe that we know of, the possibility of life itself. The first rains were about to fall. Asterisk, in those warm, chemical-rich waters, something extraordinary was stirring. Let's drift deeper into our cosmic story, to that magical time when chemistry itself began to dream of becoming something more. The early oceans had settled into a rhythm now, these vast, shallow seas that covered most of our young planet. The water was still quite warm, perhaps 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, creating what scientists lovingly call the primordial soup. But this wasn't just any soup. This was the most important recipe in the history of the universe. Imagine, if you will, those ancient waters as a vast natural laboratory stretching across continents. The oceans were rich with dissolved minerals that had leached from volcanic rocks: iron, sulfur, phosphorus, and countless other elements essential for life. But more importantly, they contained the 4 fundamental elements that would become the building blocks of every living thing: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. In this warm, nutrient-rich environment, simple molecules began to link together in ways they never had before. Picture carbon atoms, those versatile builders that form the backbone of all life, slowly learning to connect with hydrogen, with oxygen, with each other. They formed simple compounds at first: methane, water, carbon dioxide, but gradually these began to combine into more complex arrangements. The energy for this cosmic chemistry came from many sources. Lightning crackled constantly through the thick atmosphere, each bolt providing a surge of energy that could force reluctant atoms to bond together. Volcanic vents on the ocean floor created hot springs where temperatures and pressures were just right for new kinds of chemical reactions. And the young sun, though fainter than it is today, still provided a steady stream of energy to fuel these early experiments. One of the most beautiful aspects of this period was its patience. Unlike the violent bombardment of the Hadean, these chemical processes unfolded slowly, gently, over hundreds of millions of years. There was no rush, no urgency, just the persistent, methodical work of atoms finding new ways to connect. Gradually, the soup began to thicken with organic molecules. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, formed spontaneously when simple gases were sparked with energy. Nucleotides, the components of DNA and RNA, assembled themselves from phosphorus, sugar, and nitrogen-rich bases. Fatty acids clustered together, forming tiny bubble-like membranes that could separate inside from outside. Think of this process like a cosmic bakery, where the simplest ingredients were slowly being combined into more sophisticated compounds. The recipe was being written by chemistry itself, through countless trillions of random collisions and combinations. Most attempts failed, dissolving back into simpler components. But some successes were stable enough to persist, and a few even had the remarkable ability to encourage the formation of more molecules like themselves. The atmosphere during this time was still utterly alien to anything you could breathe. Methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide filled the air, gases that would be lethal to you in seconds. But for the chemical processes happening in the oceans, this reducing atmosphere was perfect. Without oxygen to break down complex molecules, organic compounds could build up to concentrations unimaginable in today's world. In certain favored locations, perhaps around volcanic vents, or in tidal pools that concentrated the soup through evaporation, the density of organic molecules became truly extraordinary. These were like cosmic honeypots, thick with the molecular machinery that life would eventually require. Some scientists believe that clay minerals on the ocean floor served as natural templates, helping to organize these early organic molecules into more complex arrangements. The clay provided surfaces where molecules could line up, increasing the chances of successful reactions. It's a beautiful thought that the very rocks of the early Earth were midwifing the birth of biology. As this great chemical experiment continued, something remarkable began to emerge from the soup, the first self-organizing systems. These weren't alive yet, not in any sense we would recognize, but they were systems of molecules that could maintain themselves, that could grow, and most importantly, that could make crude copies of themselves. And here you are tonight, billions of years later, your body built from the very same types of molecules it first assembled in that ancient soup. The proteins that power your muscles, the DNA that stores your genetic information, the membranes that surround your cells, they all trace their ancestry back to those patient chemical experiments in the primordial oceans. Your body still carries the preferences of that ancient chemistry. You function best in water-rich environments, just like those early molecular systems. Your cells still use the same basic chemical tricks that were invented in that prehistoric soup, breaking down sugars for energy, building proteins from amino acids, storing information in nucleic acids. In a very real sense, you are that primordial soup, evolved and refined over billions of years, but still fundamentally the same chemistry that first stirred in those ancient seas. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every peaceful moment of rest, it's all the legacy of those patient chemical experiments that unfolded in the warm waters of the early Earth. As millions of years continued to pass, as the soup grew richer and more complex, something unprecedented was beginning to emerge from this chemical dance. Among all the countless molecules floating in those ancient waters, a few special arrangements were discovering the most important trick in the universe, the ability to make copies of themselves. Deep in the molecular soup, the first replicators were stirring. Deep in the molecular soup, the first replicators were stirring. Let's pause here in this profound moment when chemistry first discovered the secret that would transform our planet forever, the ability to make copies of itself. Somewhere in those ancient, warm oceans, floating among billions of other molecules, a special strand of RNA was about to achieve something that had never happened before in the known universe. This wasn't just any molecule. This was a length of nucleotides that had arranged themselves in a very particular sequence, one that possessed an almost magical property. RNA, or ribonucleic acid, is like DNA's simpler, more versatile cousin. Imagine it as a long string of chemical beads, each bead representing one of 4 different types of nucleotides. The sequence of these beads determined what the RNA molecule could do, much like the sequence of letters determines the meaning of a sentence. But this particular RNA strand was special. Through pure chance, one random collision among trillions, it had folded into a shape that could do something extraordinary. It could use the raw materials floating in the primordial soup to build another molecule exactly like itself. Picture this moment, if you will. There's the original RNA strand, floating peacefully in the warm water. Around it drift all the necessary components, free nucleotides, like individual beads waiting to be strung together. And slowly, methodically, the original strand begins to assemble these pieces into an exact copy of itself. This process wasn't fast by any standard you'd recognize. It might have taken hours or even days for a single replication to complete. But speed wasn't important. Accuracy was. And this first replicator, this molecular pioneer, was able to create copies of itself with remarkable fidelity. Once the copy was complete, something beautiful happened. The new RNA strand separated from its parent and began floating independently in the soup. Now there were two molecules with the power of replication, where before there had been only one. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. These early replicators weren't perfect. Occasionally, mistakes would happen during the copying process. A nucleotide would be substituted, or skipped, or added. Most of these errors resulted in non-functional molecules that couldn't replicate. But every once in a while, a mistake would actually improve the molecule's ability to copy itself. And so began the very first evolutionary arms race. Different variants of RNA replicators began to compete for the limited resources in the soup. Some were faster at replication, some were more accurate, some were better at surviving in harsh conditions. The most successful variants produced more copies of themselves, gradually becoming more common in the primordial oceans. This was natural selection in its most primitive form, not yet operating on organisms or even cells, but on individual molecules. The RNA strands that were best at surviving and replicating gradually came to dominate the soup, while less successful variants faded away. As this molecular evolution continued over millions of years, the RNA replicators became increasingly sophisticated. Some learned to catalyze chemical reactions, speeding up processes that would otherwise take geological ages. Others developed the ability to join together with different RNA molecules, creating the first primitive teams of cooperating replicators. The soup itself began to change as these replicators multiplied. What had once been a fairly uniform mixture of simple organic molecules was now a complex ecosystem of competing and cooperating molecular entities. Certain regions of the ocean became dominated by particular types of replicators, each adapted to slightly different chemical conditions. Think of it as the world's first economy, where the currency was nucleotides, and the goal was reproduction. Some RNA molecules became specialists, molecular tools that were particularly good at specific tasks. Others remained generalists, able to function reasonably well in many different situations. The really remarkable thing about this RNA world was its creativity. These weren't just passive molecules bumping into each other randomly anymore. They were active agents, each with its own molecular agenda, each trying to outcompete its neighbors for resources and survival. Some RNA molecules even learned to work together in primitive cycles, where the product of one replicator became the raw material for another. These were the first metabolic pathways, organized sequences of chemical reactions that could extract energy from the environment and use it to fuel more replication. As the complexity grew, something new began to emerge from this molecular choreography, the first hints of information storage. The most successful RNA replicators weren't just copying themselves. They were preserving specific sequences of nucleotides that coded for useful functions. This was the birth of the genetic code, the first time in universal history that information could be stored, copied, and passed on to future generations. And here you are tonight, your cells still using RNA for many of their most essential functions. The ribosomes that build proteins in your body are largely made of RNA. The molecules that help regulate your genes are often RNA. In a very real sense, you are still living in an RNA world. It's just that it's now part of a much more complex system. The ability to store and copy information that first emerged in those ancient RNA replicators is still the foundation of everything you are. Every cell in your body carries the same genetic information, passed down through an unbroken chain of replication that stretches back 3.5 billion years to those first molecular pioneers. Your memory, your thoughts, your ability to learn and dream, they all depend on your cell's ability to store and process information. a skill that was first perfected by RNA molecules floating in the primordial soup. You are the universe's way of remembering its own history. As these RNA replicators multiplied and evolved, as they began to organize themselves into increasingly complex molecular societies, they faced a new challenge. The open ocean was a vast place, and resources were often spread thin. What they needed was a way to concentrate the good things and keep out the bad things. They needed walls. They needed the first cellular membranes. Floating in the ancient seas, the first boundaries were forming. Cellulus prokaryoticus. As Primera's membranas floating in the ancient seas, the first boundaries were forming. Let's drift gently into this next chapter of our story, where life learned one of its most important lessons: how to create a private space in the vast ocean of existence. The RNA replicators had been multiplying in the primordial soup for millions of years, but they faced an ever-growing problem. As they became more numerous and sophisticated, they were beginning to interfere with each other's work. Imagine trying to assemble a complex puzzle while dozens of other people are randomly moving the pieces around. That was the challenge facing these early molecular entities. What they needed was something that had never existed before: a way to create a controlled environment, a private workspace where delicate chemical reactions could proceed without interference. And fortunately, the soup itself contained exactly the right materials to build such boundaries. Fatty acids, simple molecules with one end that loved water and another that avoided it, had been accumulating in the primordial oceans for millions of years. When these molecules found themselves in water, they naturally arranged themselves into tiny spherical bubbles, creating the first primitive membranes. Picture these early membrane bubbles, each one no more than a few micrometers across, smaller than the tiniest speck of dust visible to your naked eye. They formed spontaneously, like soap bubbles in a bathtub, but they were far more significant than their simple appearance suggested. They represented the invention of inside and outside, the first time in Earth's history when there was a clear distinction between an organism and its environment. Some of these membrane bubbles, by pure chance, happened to form around clusters of RNA replicators. Suddenly, these replicators found themselves in a protected environment where they could work without constant interference from other molecules. It was like giving a master craftsperson their own private workshop, complete with all the tools they needed. These first cells, for that's what they were, the very first cells in Earth's history, were incredibly simple by today's standards. They had no internal structure, no specialized components, just RNA replicators floating in a small volume of soup, surrounded by a fragile membrane barrier. Scientists call these prokaryotes, meaning before the nucleus, because they lacked the complex internal organization of modern cells. But simple as they were, these early cells possessed something revolutionary: the ability to evolve as complete units. When a cell reproduced, it wasn't just copying its genetic material. It was copying its entire way of life, including its membrane, its internal chemistry, and its particular collection of molecular tools. The process of cell division in these early organisms was beautifully straightforward. As the cell grew and accumulated more resources, the membrane would gradually stretch larger. The RNA replicators inside would copy themselves, and eventually the membrane would pinch in two, creating two daughter cells where there had been one. Each daughter inherited not just the genetic information of its parent, but its entire cellular lifestyle. This innovation of cellular life opened up entirely new possibilities for evolution. Different cells could experiment with different internal chemistries while maintaining the same basic boundary structure. Some cells became better at extracting energy from sulfur compounds. Others specialized in breaking down organic molecules. And still others learned to harness the chemical energy stored in iron and other metals. The early cellular world was remarkably diverse, even in its simplicity. Different lineages of prokaryotes adapted to every conceivable environment in the ancient oceans. Some thrived in the hot water near volcanic vents. Others preferred the cooler temperatures of deeper waters. Some could tolerate high acidity, Others required more neutral conditions. But perhaps the most important innovation of this period was the development of more sophisticated methods of information storage. The RNA-based genetic systems gradually gave way to the DNA-based systems we know today. DNA was more stable than RNA, less prone to errors, and capable of storing much larger amounts of information. Think of this transition from RNA to DNA as upgrading from a small notebook to a vast library. The basic principles remained the same: information storage and replication, but the capacity and reliability improved dramatically. This allowed cells to become more complex, to develop more specialized functions, and to pass more detailed instructions to their offspring. The membrane technology also improved over time. Early membranes were quite leaky and fragile, but evolution gradually refined them into sophisticated barriers that could selectively control what entered and left the cell. They developed protein channels that could open and close on command, pumps that could move materials against concentration gradients, and sensors that could detect changes in the external environment. As these early cells multiplied and spread throughout the ancient oceans, they began to fundamentally alter the chemistry of their environment. They consumed certain molecules and produced others, gradually changing the composition of the primordial soup. The ocean was no longer just a passive container for chemical reactions. It was becoming an active ecosystem, shaped by the metabolic activities of countless microscopic organisms. Some of these early cellular communities even learned to work together in primitive ways. Cells would cluster into mats or films, creating local environments that were more favorable for their collective survival. These were the first steps toward multicellular life, though that innovation was still billions of years in the future. And here you are tonight, your body composed of trillions of cells, each one a direct descendant of those first membrane-bound pioneers. Every cell in your body still uses the same basic principle that was invented 3.5 billion years ago, a membrane barrier that creates a controlled internal environment where the complex chemistry of life can proceed. The cell membrane that surrounds each of your cells is remarkably similar to those first primitive barriers. It's still made primarily of fatty molecules with water-loving and water-avoiding ends. It still serves the same basic function of controlling what enters and leaves the cellular workspace. Your cells have inherited the preference for privacy that characterized those early cellular pioneers. They function best when they can maintain their internal chemistry without constant interference from the outside world. The membrane that protects each of your cells is a living reminder of that ancient innovation, the discovery that life works best with boundaries. As these early cells continued to multiply and diversify in the ancient oceans, some lineages were about to discover something that would change the planet forever. They were about to learn how to capture the energy of sunlight itself, and in doing so, they would begin the process of transforming Earth's entire atmosphere. The age of photosynthesis was about to dawn. High above the ancient seas, energy was streaming down from space. Asterisk high above the ancient seas, energy was streaming down from space. More energy than all the volcanic vents and chemical reactions on Earth combined. Let's drift into this luminous chapter of our story, when life first learned to eat sunlight itself. For hundreds of millions of years, life had been entirely dependent on the chemical energy stored in the molecules of the primordial soup. Cells broke down organic compounds to fuel their activities, like tiny engines burning prehistoric fuel. But this lifestyle had a fundamental problem. Eventually, the fuel would run out. Some cellular lineages had already begun to face this crisis. In their local neighborhoods of the ocean, they had consumed most of the available organic molecules and were beginning to struggle for resources. Evolution was about to solve this problem in the most elegant way imaginable, by learning to capture the virtually unlimited energy that bathed the planet every day. The sun, though fainter than it is today, still provided a constant stream of light energy to the early Earth. This energy had been falling on the planet's surface for billions of years, but no living thing had ever figured out how to use it directly. That was all about to change. Somewhere in the ancient oceans, probably in shallow areas where sunlight could penetrate the water, certain bacterial cells began to experiment with a revolutionary new lifestyle. They developed special molecules, the ancestors of chlorophyll, that could absorb light energy and use it to power chemical reactions. These first photosynthetic organisms were quite different from the plants you see today. They were still simple bacterial cells, but they had learned to construct elaborate molecular machinery for capturing photons. Picture these early photosynthesizers as solar panels with a living soul, devices that could convert sunlight into the chemical energy needed for growth and reproduction. The process they invented was beautifully simple in principle, yet incredibly sophisticated in execution. Light energy would strike their chlorophyll molecules, exciting electrons to higher energy levels. These excited electrons could then be used to power the construction of organic molecules from simple raw materials like carbon dioxide and water. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. The earliest photosynthetic bacteria were already quite successful, but they used hydrogen sulfide or other simple compounds as their source of electrons. It was a later innovation, one that would change the planet forever, that learned to extract electrons from water itself. This new form of photosynthesis, called oxygenic photosynthesis, was practiced by organisms called cyanobacteria. These remarkable bacteria had mastered the most challenging chemistry on Earth, splitting water molecules to steal their electrons. And when you split water, something interesting happens. You release oxygen as a waste product. At first, this oxygen production was barely noticeable. The early atmosphere and oceans contained many substances that readily reacted with oxygen, so any free oxygen that was produced was quickly consumed. Iron dissolved in the oceans would rust, removing oxygen from the water. Organic molecules would oxidize, using up more of this reactive gas. But the cyanobacteria kept working, day after day, year after year, century after century. Every time a photon of sunlight struck their chlorophyll, they would split another water molecule and release a bit more oxygen. What started as a barely detectable trickle gradually became a steady stream of this highly reactive gas. Picture the ancient Earth during this time as a vast battleground between the forces of oxidation and reduction. On one side, you had all the chemical substances that wanted to consume oxygen, dissolved iron, organic molecules, sulfur compounds. On the other side, you had the relentless photosynthetic activity of countless cyanobacteria, constantly producing more oxygen than the ocean could absorb. The cyanobacteria themselves began to transform the appearance of the ancient seas. They formed vast mats and films on the ocean floor, creating some of Earth's first visible ecosystems. These bacterial mats could stretch for miles, creating underwater meadows of microscopic life that swayed gently in the ancient currents. Some of these bacterial communities built the first reefs, not made of coral, but of layer upon layer of cyanobacterial mats. These structures, called stromatolites, created complex three-dimensional environments where different species of bacteria could specialize in different roles. Some focused on photosynthesis, others on breaking down organic waste, still others on recycling nutrients. The innovation of photosynthesis also led to the first daily rhythms in Earth's biosphere. During the day, when sunlight was available, the cyanobacteria would photosynthesize actively, producing organic molecules and releasing oxygen. At night, they would switch to a different metabolism, breaking down some of the organic molecules they had made during the day. This was the birth of circadian rhythms, biological clocks, that allowed organisms to anticipate and prepare for the predictable cycle of day and night. Even today, nearly every living thing on Earth, including you, operates according to these ancient rhythms that were first established by photosynthetic bacteria billions of years ago. As photosynthesis became more widespread and efficient, it fundamentally altered the energy balance of the planet. For the first time in Earth's history, the biosphere was capturing and storing significant amounts of solar energy. This energy didn't just power the growth of individual organisms. It began to accumulate in the form of organic matter, creating the first biological carbon cycle. The success of photosynthetic life was so dramatic that it began to outcompete many of the older, chemically dependent forms of life. Organisms that had thrived in the chemical soup for millions of years found themselves in a changing world where solar-powered competitors could grow faster and more efficiently. And here you are tonight, your very existence made possible by that ancient innovation of photosynthesis. The oxygen you breathe so effortlessly was first produced by cyanobacteria 3 billion years ago. Every breath you take connects you directly to those pioneering photosynthetic organisms that learned to eat sunlight. The food you consume today, whether it came from plants directly or from animals that ate plants, all of it represents stored solar energy that was captured through photosynthesis. You are quite literally made of sunlight that was captured and converted into biological matter by the descendants of those ancient cyanobacteria. Your body still operates on the circadian rhythms that were first established by photosynthetic bacteria. Your sleep-wake cycle, your daily fluctuations in body temperature, even the timing of your dreams, they all echo those first biological clocks that learned to track the passage of day and night 3 billion years ago. As the cyanobacteria continued their patient work, as they multiplied into vast underwater meadows and filled the ancient seas with their oxygen waste, they were setting the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The oxygen they were producing was about to reach a tipping point, and when it did, it would poison the very atmosphere that had nurtured life for billions of years. The poison was building slowly, invisibly, in the ancient atmosphere. The poison was building slowly, invisibly, in the ancient atmosphere. Let's pause here, in this most paradoxical chapter of our story, when the waste product of one form of life became the essential breath of another. For perhaps 500 million years, the cyanobacteria had been quietly revolutionizing the planet with their photosynthetic lifestyle. But the changes they were causing remained largely hidden, absorbed by the iron-rich oceans and the chemical processes of the early Earth. The planet seemed stable, unchanging, and then, quite suddenly in geological terms, everything shifted. The Great Oxygenation Event, as scientists call it, was one of the most dramatic atmospheric transformations in Earth's history. It wasn't a gradual process. It was more like a dam bursting, releasing accumulated oxygen into an atmosphere that had never known such levels of this reactive gas. Picture the ancient Earth's atmosphere before this event. It was a reducing environment, rich in methane, hydrogen, and ammonia gases that would be utterly poisonous to you tonight, but which had been the stable backdrop for life for over 1 billion years. Oxygen, that life-giving gas you breathe so effortlessly, existed only in trace amounts, immediately consumed by chemical reactions with iron and other minerals. But the cyanobacteria had finally overwhelmed the planet's ability to absorb their oxygen waste. After hundreds of millions of years of patient photosynthesis, they had filled all the available chemical sinks. The dissolved iron in the oceans had been oxidized into great bands of iron ore that we can still see in rocks today. The atmospheric gases that readily reacted with oxygen had been consumed. And still, the cyanobacteria continued their relentless production of this highly reactive molecule. When the tipping point was reached, the change was catastrophic. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose from virtually 0 to perhaps 1%, a tiny fraction by today's standards, but an overwhelming flood for organisms that had evolved in an oxygen-free world. To most life forms of that era, oxygen was a deadly poison. It was highly reactive, capable of breaking down the organic molecules that formed the basis of cellular machinery. Many of the organisms that had thrived for billions of years in the ancient oxygen-free world found themselves suddenly living in a toxic environment. This was Earth's first great extinction event, triggered not by an asteroid impact or volcanic eruption, but by the life activities of photosynthetic organisms. Vast communities of anaerobic bacteria Organisms that had dominated the planet for over 1 billion years began to die off as their environments became increasingly oxygenated. But evolution, as always, found a way to turn crisis into opportunity. Some lineages of bacteria developed mechanisms to cope with the toxic oxygen. They evolved antioxidant systems, molecular tools that could neutralize the harmful effects of this reactive gas. Some even learned to use oxygen's reactivity to their advantage, developing new forms of metabolism that could extract far more energy from organic molecules than had ever been possible before. This new oxygen-based metabolism was incredibly efficient. When you burn organic molecules with oxygen, you can extract roughly 20 times more energy than from the anaerobic processes that had powered life for billions of years. It was like upgrading from a campfire to a high-efficiency furnace. The organisms that mastered this new aerobic lifestyle found themselves with access to energy resources beyond anything their ancestors had ever known. They could grow faster, reproduce more rapidly, and explore environments that had been inaccessible to their anaerobic predecessors. The Great Oxygenation Event also had profound effects on the planet's climate. Methane, which had been an abundant greenhouse gas in the early atmosphere, began to react with the newly abundant oxygen. This reduced the greenhouse effect and led to a dramatic cooling of the planet. Some scientists believe that this cooling was so severe that it triggered the first major ice age in Earth's history, a period called the Huronian glaciation that may have lasted for hundreds of millions of years. Picture the planet during this time: vast ice sheets extending from the poles toward the equator, a thin but growing oxygen atmosphere, and ecosystems in complete upheaval as life forms adapted to the new chemical reality. It was perhaps the most dramatic planetary transformation since the end of the heavy bombardment 2 billion years earlier. The iron formations that precipitated during this period created some of the most distinctive rock layers in Earth's geological record. These banded iron formations, with their alternating layers of iron-rich and silica-rich minerals, tell the story of the oxygen catastrophe in exquisite detail. They record the periodic fluctuations in oxygen levels as the planet's systems struggled to reach a new equilibrium. As the oxygen levels continued to rise, they eventually reached a plateau, somewhere between 1 and 10% of current atmospheric levels. This was still far below the 21% we breathe today, but it was enough to support the new oxygen-based forms of life that were emerging from the crisis. The survivors of the Great Oxygenation Event were fundamentally different from their ancestors. They had been tested by one of the most severe environmental challenges in Earth's history and had emerged with new capabilities, new metabolisms, and new ways of dealing with the chemical complexities of their transformed world. This event also set the stage for the next great innovation in the history of life. The abundant energy available from oxygen-based metabolism would eventually make possible the evolution of much larger, more complex cells that could support the kind of internal organization necessary for truly sophisticated life forms. And here you are tonight, your every breath a testament to that ancient atmospheric revolution. The oxygen that flows through your bloodstream, powering every cell in your body, was once a deadly poison that nearly sterilized the planet. Your ancestors, the bacterial lineages that survived the Great Oxygenation Event, passed down to you the molecular machinery needed to not just tolerate oxygen, but to thrive on it. Your cells still use the same basic antioxidant systems that were first developed during that ancient crisis. The enzymes that protect your cellular machinery from oxygen damage are direct descendants of the molecular tools that allowed life to survive the oxygen catastrophe 2.5 billion years ago. The efficient metabolism that powers your thoughts, your movements, your dreams, it all depends on the oxygen-based energy systems that evolved during this period of crisis. You are powered by an innovation that emerged from one of the greatest environmental disasters in Earth's history. As the planet slowly adjusted to its new oxygen-rich atmosphere, as life learned not just to tolerate, but to harness the power of this reactive gas, the stage was set for the next great leap in biological complexity. The abundant energy now available from aerobic metabolism would soon make possible something that had never existed before. Cells with internal structure, internal organization, the first eukaryotic cells. In the oxygen-rich waters of the ancient seas, something new was stirring. In the oxygen-rich waters of the ancient seas, something new was stirring. Cells were about to discover the power of internal organization. Let's drift into this remarkable chapter, when life learned to build communities within itself. The great oxygenation event had fundamentally transformed the planet. But perhaps its most important consequence wasn't immediately obvious. The abundant energy now available from oxygen-based metabolism made possible a level of cellular complexity that had never existed before. Cells could now afford to be larger, more elaborate, more internally organized. For over 1 billion years, all life had been prokaryotic, simple cells without internal compartments, where all the cellular machinery floated freely in a single space. But now, some lineages began to experiment with a revolutionary new architecture: cells with internal structure, internal boundaries, internal specialization. These new eukaryotic cells, meaning true nucleus, were marvels of biological engineering. Instead of being simple bags of molecular machinery, they were more like microscopic cities, with specialized districts for different cellular functions. At the heart of each cell was a nucleus, a membrane-bound compartment that housed the cell's genetic material, protecting it from the chemical chaos of the surrounding cytoplasm. But the nucleus was just the beginning. These early eukaryotic cells developed an entire system of internal membranes, creating specialized compartments for different aspects of cellular life. There were compartments for protein synthesis, compartments for waste processing, compartments for energy storage, each optimized for its particular function. Picture these early eukaryotic cells as the first biological factories, where instead of having all the workers and machinery jumbled together in one big room, different processes were organized into specialized departments. This internal organization allowed for much more sophisticated and efficient cellular operations. The most important innovation of this period was probably the evolution of mitochondria, the tiny organelles that serve as the powerhouses of eukaryotic cells. But mitochondria have a fascinating origin story that reveals something profound about the nature of life itself. Mitochondria were once free-living bacteria, similar to many species that still exist in the oceans today. These were aerobic bacteria that had mastered the art of using oxygen to extract maximum energy from organic molecules. But sometime around 2 billion years ago, instead of being consumed by a larger cell, these bacteria became permanent residents. This process, called endosymbiosis, was one of the most important evolutionary innovations in the history of life. Picture a large early eukaryotic cell engulfing a smaller aerobic bacterium, perhaps as an attempt to eat it. But instead of being digested, the bacterium survived inside the larger cell and began to provide energy services to its host. It was the ultimate partnership. The host cell provided protection and raw materials, while the bacterial resident provided high-efficiency energy production. Over millions of years, this partnership became so intimate that the bacteria could no longer survive independently. They had become permanent cellular residents, mitochondria. The evidence for this remarkable origin story is still visible in every cell of your body tonight. Mitochondria retain their own small circular genomes, separate from the main cellular DNA in the nucleus. They reproduce independently within cells, much like their bacterial ancestors. And their internal structure and biochemistry are unmistakably bacterial in origin. Some eukaryotic lineages went even further with endosymbiosis. They engulfed photosynthetic bacteria, probably cyanobacteria, and established them as permanent residents as well. These became chloroplasts, the organelles that perform photosynthesis in plants and algae. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts retain their own genomes and reproduce independently within cells. The evolution of eukaryotic cells also brought with it a new level of genetic sophistication. The nuclear genome was much larger and more complex than anything that had existed in prokaryotic cells. Genes could be regulated in new ways, turned on and off in response to cellular conditions. The genetic machinery itself became more elaborate, with multiple stages of processing between gene and final protein product. This increased genetic complexity allowed eukaryotic cells to develop more sophisticated responses to their environment. They could change their metabolism, their shape, even their behavior in response to changing conditions. Some developed the ability to move actively through the water, using whip-like flagella or hair-like cilia to propel themselves toward favorable conditions and away from threats. The cytoskeleton, an internal framework of protein fibers, gave eukaryotic cells unprecedented structural flexibility. Unlike the rigid cell walls of most bacteria, eukaryotic cells could change shape, extend temporary projections called pseudopodia, and even engulf other cells or particles. This flexibility opened up entirely new ecological possibilities. Some early eukaryotic cells became predators, actively hunting and consuming other cells. Others became grazers, feeding on the bacterial mats that covered the ocean floor. Still others maintained photosynthetic lifestyles, but with the added efficiency of their mitochondrial powerhouses supporting their cellular operations. The size difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells was dramatic. While bacteria typically measured just a few micrometers across, eukaryotic cells could be 10 to 100 times larger. This increase in size allowed for much more complex internal organization and opened up new ecological niches. As eukaryotic cells continued to evolve and diversify, they began to explore new environments and new lifestyles. Some became specialized for life in the open ocean, others for the seafloor, still others for the shallow waters near shore. Each environment selected for different cellular adaptations and innovations. The sexual reproduction that would later become so important for complex life also had its origins during this period. Early eukaryotic cells developed the ability to exchange genetic material with other cells, creating offspring with novel combinations of genes. This greatly accelerated the pace of evolution and allowed for much more rapid adaptation to changing conditions. And here you are tonight, your body built entirely of eukaryotic cells, each one a descendant of those first complex cells that evolved 2 billion years ago. Every cell in your body contains dozens or hundreds of mitochondria, still carrying out the same energy-producing functions that were first established by those ancient bacterial endosymbionts. The mitochondria in your cells still retain their own DNA, still reproduce independently, still bear the molecular signatures of their bacterial ancestry. When you breathe, when your heart beats, when your brain processes thoughts, it's all powered by these ancient partnerships between host cells and bacterial residents. Your cell's ability to change shape, to move materials around internally, to respond dynamically to changing conditions. All of these capabilities trace back to innovations that first emerged in early eukaryotic cells. You are a walking, breathing testament to the power of internal organization and cooperative partnerships. As these complex eukaryotic cells continued to multiply and diversify in the ancient oceans, they were about to discover something that would revolutionize not just their own existence, but the entire future of life on Earth. They were about to invent a new way of reproducing, a way that involved not one parent, but two. In the depths of the ancient seas, two cells were about to meet. Asterisk. In the depths of the ancient seas, two cells were about to meet in a way that had never happened before in the history of life. Let's drift into this intimate chapter of our cosmic story, when biology invented its greatest gamble, the merging of two into one. For over 2 billion years, reproduction had been a solitary affair. When a cell was ready to reproduce, it simply copied its genetic material and divided into two identical offspring. This asexual reproduction was efficient and reliable. Every offspring was guaranteed to inherit the complete genetic instructions that had made the parent successful. But some lineages of eukaryotic cells were about to experiment with a radically different approach, one that seemed almost recklessly inefficient at first glance. Instead of producing offspring independently, they would require the cooperation of two separate individuals, each contributing half of their genetic material to create something entirely new. The innovation of sexual reproduction was one of the most counterintuitive developments in the history of evolution. Think about it from a purely mathematical perspective. With asexual reproduction, every individual can potentially reproduce, and each offspring carries 100% of a successful parent's genes. With sexual reproduction, you need two individuals to create offspring, and each offspring carries only 50% of any given parent's genes. So why did this seemingly inefficient system evolve? The answer lies in the power of genetic diversity. Imagine the early eukaryotic cells living in an ancient ocean that was constantly changing. Temperatures fluctuated, chemical compositions shifted, new diseases emerged, food sources appeared and disappeared. In this unpredictable environment, having identical offspring, genetic copies, was actually a liability. If conditions changed in a way that made the parent's genetic combination less favorable, all the offspring would be equally vulnerable. Sexual reproduction solved this problem by creating offspring that were genetic mixtures, combinations of genes from two different parents. Each offspring represented a new experiment in genetic combination, a new solution to the challenges of survival. If the environment changed, at least some of these genetic experiments would likely be well suited to the new conditions. The early forms of sexual reproduction were quite different from what you might imagine. There were no males and females in the sense we understand today. Instead, they were simply different mating types, cells that were biochemically compatible for genetic exchange. When two compatible cells encountered each other, they would undergo a complex molecular dance that culminated in the fusion of their genetic material. Picture these early sexual encounters taking place in the warm, nutrient-rich waters of ancient tidal pools or shallow bays. Two microscopic cells, each carrying the accumulated genetic wisdom of billions of years of evolution, would recognize each other through chemical signals and begin the process of genetic merger. The mechanics of this process were remarkably sophisticated, even in its earliest forms. The cells had to synchronize their genetic machinery, carefully align their chromosomes, and then physically exchange segments of DNA. This process, called recombination, shuffled the genetic deck in ways that created unprecedented diversity. But sexual reproduction brought with it an entirely new set of challenges. Cells had to evolve mechanisms for finding compatible mates in the vast ocean. They developed chemical attractants, the ancient predecessors of pheromones, that could signal their readiness to reproduce across considerable distances. They also had to solve the problem of genetic compatibility. Not just any two cells could successfully merge their genetic material. They had to be closely related enough that their genes could work together, but different enough that the merger would create useful diversity. This led to the evolution of increasingly sophisticated mating systems and species recognition mechanisms. The offspring produced by sexual reproduction were unlike anything that had existed before. Each one was a unique genetic individual, carrying novel combinations of genes that had never been tested by natural selection. Some of these combinations would prove highly successful, others less so, but all represented new experiments in the art of living. Sexual reproduction also accelerated the pace of evolution dramatically. With asexual reproduction, beneficial genetic changes could only accumulate one at a time, linearly. But with sexual reproduction, beneficial changes that arose in different individuals could be combined in their offspring, allowing for much more rapid adaptation to changing conditions. The genetic diversity created by sexual reproduction also provided insurance against diseases and parasites. Asexual populations were vulnerable to pathogens that could exploit their genetic uniformity. If a disease could successfully attack one individual, it could potentially wipe out the entire population. But sexually reproducing populations, with their genetic diversity, always included some individuals that would be resistant to any given pathogen. As sexual reproduction became more widespread among eukaryotic cells, it began to drive an evolutionary arms race. Populations that reproduced sexually could adapt more quickly to changing conditions, giving them advantages over their asexually reproducing neighbors. This created selective pressure for more and more lineages to adopt sexual reproduction, even despite its apparent inefficiencies. The evolution of sex also led to the development of increasingly complex life cycles. Some organisms began to alternate between diploid phases, with 2 copies of each chromosome, and haploid phases, with single copies. Others developed elaborate mating rituals and mate selection processes. Perhaps most importantly, sexual reproduction laid the groundwork for all the complex multicellular life that would follow. The genetic diversity it created would prove essential for the evolution of specialized cell types, complex developmental programs, and the intricate ecosystems that would eventually cover the planet. The ancient seas during this period became increasingly diverse as sexually reproducing eukaryotic cells explored new ecological niches and developed new adaptations. Some lineages specialized in photosynthesis, others in predation, still others in decomposition. The genetic mixing provided by sexual reproduction allowed them to fine-tune their adaptations with unprecedented precision. And here you are tonight, the product of nearly 1 billion years of sexual reproduction. Every cell in your body carries genetic material that was mixed and remixed countless times through the sexual reproduction of your ancestors. You are a unique genetic individual, carrying combinations of genes that have never existed before and will never exist again. The genetic diversity that created you began with those first experimental matings in the ancient seas. The fact that you are genetically unique, different from every other human who has ever lived or ever will live, is a direct consequence of that ancient innovation of sexual reproduction. Your immune system's ability to fight off diseases, your body's capacity to adapt to different environments, even your individual personality and capabilities, they all depend on the genetic diversity that sexual reproduction has been creating and maintaining for 1 billion years. As sexual reproduction spread throughout the populations of eukaryotic cells, as genetic diversity flourished in the ancient oceans, life was preparing for its next great adventure. Individual cells had mastered the arts of internal organization and genetic mixing, but they were about to discover something even more remarkable: the power of cooperation between cells, the first experiments in multicellular life. In the warm shallows of the ancient seas, cells were beginning to stay together, In the warm shallows of the ancient seas, cells were beginning to stay together after division, and in doing so, they were about to discover one of life's most powerful secrets. Let's drift into this collaborative chapter, when individual cells learn to become something greater than themselves. For over 3 billion years, cellular life had been fundamentally independent. Each cell was a complete organism unto itself, responsible for all aspects of its own survival, finding food, avoiding threats, reproducing, maintaining its internal chemistry. But around 1 billion years ago, some lineages began to experiment with a radically different lifestyle: cooperation. The first multicellular organisms were probably quite simple, just small clusters of identical cells that remained attached to each other after cell division. Instead of the daughter cells separating and going their own ways, they stayed together, forming tiny colonies floating in the ancient seas. Picture these early multicellular pioneers as small spheres or chains of cells, each individual cell still capable of independent survival, but now part of a larger collective. At first glance, this might seem like a step backward. Why would successful independent cells choose to encumber themselves with permanent partners? The answer lies in the advantages that cooperation could provide. A cluster of cells working together could be more effective at gathering food than individual cells working alone. They could create stronger currents in the water, sweeping in more nutrients. They could share resources when some cells encountered feast and others faced famine. But perhaps most importantly, multicellular life opened up the possibility of specialization. In a cluster of identical cells, different individuals could begin to focus on different tasks. Some cells could specialize in feeding, others in reproduction, still others in protection or movement. This division of labor made the entire organism more efficient than any individual cell could be on its own. The evolution of multicellularity required solving several fundamental challenges. The first was communication. Cells needed ways to coordinate their activities with their neighbors. They developed chemical signaling systems, releasing molecules that could influence the behavior of nearby cells. These were the first steps toward the complex intercellular communication networks that coordinate your body's activities tonight. The second challenge was adhesion. Cells needed reliable ways to stick together. They evolved specialized proteins that could form strong but flexible connections between neighboring cells. These cellular adhesions had to be robust enough to hold the organism together, but flexible enough to allow for growth and movement. Perhaps the most difficult challenge was the evolution of regulated cell death. In a multicellular organism, sometimes individual cells need to die for the good of the whole. This might seem paradoxical. Why would evolution favor cells that would sacrifice themselves? But programmed cell death proved essential for creating complex, multicellular structures and eliminating cells that had become damaged or infected. As multicellular organisms became more sophisticated, they began to develop increasingly complex body plans. Some early forms resembled simple sponges, with cells organized into basic filtering systems that could process large volumes of water to extract nutrients. Others developed more active lifestyles, with coordinated movement and primitive sensory capabilities. The Ediacaran period, named after a region in Australia where some of the best fossils are found, saw an explosion of diverse multicellular life forms. These organisms were unlike anything that exists today. Strange, soft-bodied creatures that carpeted the seafloor and the ancient oceans. Some looked like fronds or discs, others like quilted mattresses or alien flowers. These Ediacaran organisms represented early experiments in multicellular body plans. They tried out different approaches to feeding, movement, and reproduction. Some were probably photosynthetic, hosting symbiotic bacteria that could capture solar energy. Others were filter feeders, processing seawater to extract organic particles. Still others may have been early predators, actively hunting smaller organisms. The evolution of multicellularity also led to the development of the first tissues groups of specialized cells that worked together to perform specific functions. These early tissues were simple compared to what would evolve later, but they represented a fundamental innovation in biological organization. Some multicellular organisms developed primitive nervous systems, networks of cells, specialized for transmitting information rapidly throughout the body. These early neural networks were far simpler than your brain, but they allowed for coordinated responses to environmental changes that would have been impossible for individual cells. The size advantages of multicellular life were dramatic. While individual eukaryotic cells were limited to sizes measured in micrometers, multicellular organisms could grow to centimeters or even meters in length. This increase in size provided protection from single-celled predators and access to new ecological niches. Multicellular organisms also developed the first complex life cycles, with different stages specialized for different functions. Some stages might be optimized for growth and feeding, others for reproduction, still others for dispersal or survival during harsh conditions. The biochemical innovations of multicellular life were equally impressive. Different cell types could produce different enzymes and proteins, allowing the organism as a whole to perform chemical reactions that no individual cell could accomplish. This biochemical specialization greatly expanded the range of environments and food sources that life could exploit. As multicellular organisms became more common and diverse, they began to transform their ecosystems in fundamental ways. They created new types of habitat structure, new food webs, and new ecological relationships. The simple bacterial mats that had dominated marine ecosystems for billions of years now shared space with these complex, multicellular pioneers. The evolution of multicellularity also set the stage for all the biological innovations that would follow. Complex organs, sophisticated sensory systems, advanced behavior, consciousness itself, all of these would build upon the fundamental breakthrough of cellular cooperation that first emerged in the ancient seas of the Proterozoic era. And here you are tonight, your body a magnificent example of multicellular cooperation taken to extraordinary heights. Your trillions of cells work together with a coordination and efficiency that would make those early Ediacaran organisms seem simple by comparison. Every breath you take requires the cooperation of cells in your lungs, your diaphragm, your nervous system, and your circulatory system. Your thoughts depend on the coordinated activity of billions of neurons, each one a descendant of those first neural cells that evolved in primitive multicellular organisms. The cellular adhesions that hold your body together, the chemical signals that coordinate your cellular activities, the programmed cell death that sculpted your body during development. All of these trace back to innovations that first emerged when cells learned to cooperate in the ancient seas. As multicellular life became increasingly sophisticated in the warm seas of the late Proterozoic, as organisms experimented with new body plans and new ways of living, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of life. These complex organisms were about to discover entirely new ways of being alive. The Cambrian explosion was about to begin. In the shallows of the Cambrian seas, something extraordinary was stirring. In the shallows of the Cambrian seas, something extraordinary was stirring. Life was about to get creative in ways it had never imagined before. Let's drift into this explosive chapter, when biology became an artist and painted the oceans with forms of breathtaking diversity. For nearly 4 billion years, life had been a patient experimenter, slowly developing the fundamental technologies of existence: metabolism, reproduction, multicellular cooperation. But around 540 million years ago, all of that patient groundwork suddenly blossomed into an explosion of creativity, so dramatic that scientists call it one of the most important events in the history of life. The Cambrian explosion wasn't literally an explosion, of course. It unfolded over millions of years, which is rapid only by geological standards. But in evolutionary terms, it was breathtakingly fast. In a period of time that represents just over 1% of life's total history, most of the major animal body plans that exist today first appeared in the fossil record. Picture the Cambrian seas as nature's greatest laboratory, where evolution was conducting thousands of experiments simultaneously. The warm, shallow oceans were filled with creatures that would seem utterly alien to your modern eyes. And yet, if you looked carefully, you would see the first hints of all the animals you're familiar with today. The key innovation that made the Cambrian explosion possible was the evolution of hard parts, shells, exoskeletons, spines, and other durable structures. For billions of years, life had been soft-bodied, leaving few fossils behind. But the Cambrian animals learned to build armor, and in doing so, they created a permanent record of evolution's greatest creative period. Why did hard parts evolve so rapidly during this time? The answer probably lies in the emergence of predation as a major ecological force. The peaceful Ediacaran organisms that had dominated earlier seas were about to encounter something they had never dealt with before: animals that actively hunted and consumed other animals. Anomalocaris, one of the Cambrian's most fearsome predators, cruised through the ancient seas like a living nightmare. At over a meter in length, it was enormous by the standards of its time. Its front appendages were lined with sharp spines for grasping prey, and its circular mouth was filled with radiating teeth. For the small, soft-bodied creatures of the early Cambrian, Anomalocaris represented an existential threat that demanded evolutionary responses. And respond they did. The Cambrian seas witnessed an evolutionary arms race of unprecedented intensity. Prey species evolved shells, spines, and armor plating. They developed the ability to burrow into sediment, to swim rapidly away from threats, to detect predators from a distance. Predators, in turn, evolved more powerful jaws, more effective hunting strategies, more sophisticated sensory systems. One of the most important innovations of the Cambrian was the evolution of complex eyes. Vision had existed before, but the Cambrian animals perfected it to a degree that had never been seen. Trilobites, those iconic Cambrian arthropods, developed compound eyes with thousands of individual lenses, each one made of perfectly transparent calcite crystal. These eyes could detect movement, judge distances, and track prey or predators with remarkable precision. The trilobites themselves were marvels of biological engineering. Their jointed exoskeletons provided both protection and flexibility. Their numerous legs allowed for efficient swimming and crawling, and their sophisticated nervous systems coordinated complex behaviors. They were so successful that they dominated marine ecosystems for nearly 300 million years. But trilobites were just one of many remarkable Cambrian innovations. The period saw the evolution of the first vertebrates, primitive fish-like creatures called conodonts that possessed the earliest backbones. These humble ancestors would eventually give rise to all vertebrate life, including you. Euoxia looked like a living pincushion, covered in protective spines and scales. Opibenia had 5 eyes and a trunk-like appendage with a claw at the end for grabbing prey. Hallucigenia was so bizarre that paleontologists initially reconstructed it upside down. It walked on stilts and had protective spines running along its back. Perhaps the most important Cambrian innovation was the evolution of complex developmental programs, the genetic instructions that guide the growth of multicellular organisms from single fertilized eggs into complex adults. The Hox genes that control body segmentation in animals from insects to humans first appeared during this period. These developmental innovations allowed Cambrian animals to experiment with radically different body plans. Some were radially symmetrical like flowers, others were bilaterally symmetrical like most modern animals. Some had 5-fold symmetry, others had no clear symmetry at all. It was as if evolution was trying out every possible approach to building an animal body. The Cambrian seas were also transformed by the evolution of complex behaviors. Animals began to actively modify their environments, building burrows, constructing reef-like structures, and creating complex ecological relationships. The simple bacterial mats that had dominated seafloors for billions of years were now churned up by burrowing animals, creating new types of sedimentary environments. Filter feeding became much more sophisticated, with animals developing elaborate feeding structures that could process vast quantities of seawater. Some Cambrian animals were suspension feeders, extracting organic particles from the water column. Others were deposit feeders, processing sediment to extract nutrients. The Cambrian explosion also saw the first experiments with biomineralization, the controlled precipitation of minerals to form biological structures. Animals learned to build shells of calcium carbonate, exoskeletons of chitin, and spicules of silica. These hard parts not only provided protection, but also enabled new types of mechanical functions. Communication between animals became more complex during this period. Chemical signaling, which had existed in simple forms for billions of years, was refined into sophisticated pheromone systems. Visual signaling may have emerged as animals developed better eyes and more colorful body patterns. The diversity of Cambrian life was truly staggering. In the famous Burgess Shale deposits of Canada, paleontologists have found evidence of life forms so bizarre that they seem to belong to an alien world. Yet careful study reveals that most of these strange creatures were early experiments in animal body plans that would eventually evolve into the familiar forms we know today. And here you are tonight, your body built according to the same basic developmental programs that first emerged during the Cambrian explosion. The bilateral symmetry of your body, with its distinct head and tail ends, left and right sides, back and belly, was established during this creative period 540 million years ago. Your backbone traces its ancestry to those first primitive vertebrates that swam in Cambrian seas. Your eyes use the same basic biochemistry for detecting light that was perfected in trilobites and other Cambrian animals. The complex developmental cascades that shaped your body during your time in the womb follow genetic programs that were first written during the Cambrian explosion. Even your immune system carries echoes of those ancient predator-prey arms races. The molecular recognition systems that allow your body to distinguish self from non-self are sophisticated versions of the chemical defense systems that first evolved when animals began actively hunting each other in Cambrian seas. As the Cambrian seas teemed with increasingly sophisticated life, as predators and prey engaged in their ancient dance of evolution, some lineages were beginning to look beyond the oceans toward new frontiers. The land surface of the planet, sterile and empty for over 4 billion years, was about to receive its first living visitors. The great conquest of the land was about to begin. Beyond the safety of the ancient seas, a harsh and empty landscape waited, a world of rock and sky that had known no living thing for over 4 billion years. Let's venture into this pioneering chapter, when life took its boldest step yet and learned to live without the ocean's embrace. For nearly 4 billion years, life had been entirely aquatic. Every living thing, from the simplest bacteria to the most complex Cambrian creatures, had spent its entire existence surrounded by water. The land surface of the planet was an alien environment, a sterile wasteland of rock and sand, scoured by wind and radiation, with no protection from the harsh realities of existence outside the ocean's gentle embrace. But around 450 million years ago, some of life's most adventurous pioneers began to venture beyond the water's edge. It wasn't a sudden migration. It was a gradual exploration that probably began in the marginal zones, where land and sea met, tidal pools, mudflats, river deltas, and shallow lagoons. Picture these early terrestrial environments as some of the most challenging habitats on Earth. During the day, surfaces could become scorching hot under the direct sun. At night, temperatures could plummet. There was no buffering effect of water to moderate these extremes. The air was thin and offered no support for movement. Creatures that had evolved to swim or glide through water found themselves struggling against gravity in ways they had never experienced. Perhaps most challenging of all, there was the constant threat of desiccation. Water had always been everywhere, infinite and abundant. But on land, water existed only in scattered pools and streams. The risk of drying out was constant and deadly. The first terrestrial colonists were probably simple organisms, bacteria, algae, and primitive fungi that could form protective films and crusts on moist surfaces. These pioneer species began the slow process of transforming the sterile land surface into something that could support more complex life. Fungi played a particularly important role in these early terrestrial ecosystems. They could extend thread-like networks through soil and rock, breaking down minerals and organic matter. They formed partnerships with early plants, providing essential nutrients in exchange for carbohydrates. These fungal networks became the foundation of all terrestrial food webs. The first true plants to colonize land were probably similar to modern liverworts and mosses simple, small organisms that hugged the ground and required constant moisture to survive. They had no true roots, stems, or leaves, but they possessed something revolutionary, the ability to extract water and nutrients directly from soil and rock. These early plants faced extraordinary challenges. They had to develop new structural materials to support themselves against gravity. In water, organisms could rely on buoyancy for support, but on land they needed rigid stems and strong cell walls. They evolved lignin, a complex polymer that could provide structural strength while remaining lightweight. Water transport became a critical innovation. Marine organisms could absorb water directly through their surfaces, but terrestrial plants needed systems to move water from soil to their photosynthetic tissues. They developed the first vascular systems, networks of specialized cells that could transport water and nutrients throughout the plant body. Reproduction on land required completely new strategies. In water, organisms could simply release their reproductive cells into the current. But on land, gametes would quickly dry out and die. Early plants developed protected reproductive structures and eventually evolved seeds, remarkable packages that could protect developing embryos from desiccation and provide them with stored nutrients for growth. The conquest of land wasn't just about plants. Arthropods, relatives of trilobites and other marine creatures, were among the first animals to venture onto land. These early terrestrial arthropods probably resembled modern millipedes and centipedes, feeding on the organic matter that was beginning to accumulate in terrestrial environments. The evolution of terrestrial arthropods required major physiological innovations. They needed more efficient breathing systems to extract oxygen from air rather than water. They developed spiracles and tracheal systems that could deliver oxygen directly to their tissues. They also needed better protection against desiccation and more sophisticated sensory systems to navigate in a three-dimensional aerial environment. As plants and arthropods established themselves on land, they created opportunities for other organisms to follow. Predatory arthropods evolved to hunt the herbivorous species. Decomposer organisms evolved to break down the dead plant matter that was accumulating on land for the first time in Earth's history. The early terrestrial ecosystems were quite different from anything we see today. Plants were small and simple, rarely growing more than a few centimeters tall. There were no trees, no flowers, no grasses, just carpets of simple bryophytes and early vascular plants covering the landscape in shades of green and brown. But these humble beginnings set in motion a transformation that would reshape the entire planet. As plants spread across the land surface, they began to alter the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. They absorbed carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, gradually changing the planet's climate. They weathered rocks more rapidly than purely physical processes, altering the global cycles of nutrients and minerals. The presence of vegetation on land also changed patterns of erosion and sedimentation. Plant roots held soil together, reducing the amount of sediment that washed into the oceans. Terrestrial ecosystems began to develop their own nutrient cycles, independent of marine systems. Perhaps most importantly, the colonization of land opened up vast new territories for evolution to explore. The land surface represented roughly 30% of the planet's total area, an enormous expansion of available habitat. Different regions offered different climatic conditions, different soil types, different challenges and opportunities. As terrestrial ecosystems became more established, they began to support increasingly complex food webs. Herbivorous arthropods diversified to exploit different types of plant material. Predatory species evolved to hunt the herbivores. Parasitic species developed to exploit the predators. Decomposer communities evolved to recycle nutrients from all of these organisms. The conquest of land also set the stage for one of evolution's most dramatic innovations, the eventual evolution of vertebrates that could live permanently on land. Fish had already begun to develop primitive lungs and limb-like fins, but it would take millions more years before they would fully adapt to terrestrial life. And here you are tonight, a terrestrial creature whose every adaptation speaks to that ancient conquest of the land. Your lungs, which extract oxygen from air rather than water, are sophisticated versions of the breathing systems first developed by early terrestrial organisms. Your skeleton provides structural support against gravity, using the same basic principle of internal framework that was first perfected by early land plants and animals. Your skin protects you from desiccation, just as the protective surfaces of those pioneer species protected them from the harsh terrestrial environment. Even your diet ultimately depends on terrestrial plant life. Whether you eat plants directly or consume animals that eat plants, the foundation of your nutrition traces back to those first simple plants that learned to photosynthesize on land 450 million years ago. As life established its foothold on land, as terrestrial ecosystems became more complex and sophisticated, the stage was set for one of evolution's most ambitious projects. Some of those early fish in the ancient waters were developing features that would allow them to venture onto land themselves. The first vertebrates were about to emerge from the sea. In the shallow waters near ancient shorelines, fish were beginning to change. In the shallow waters near ancient shorelines, fish were beginning to change in ways that would transform the entire future of life on Earth. Let's drift into this pivotal chapter, when your distant ancestors first developed the backbone that would carry vertebrate life to every corner of the planet. The story of vertebrate evolution begins with some of the most humble and unlikely heroes in life's long history. Small, primitive fish swimming in the ancient seas of the Devonian period. These early vertebrates were quite different from the sleek, powerful fish you might imagine. They were often heavily armored, bottom-dwelling creatures that looked more like swimming tanks than the graceful swimmers that would evolve later. But these ancient fish possessed something revolutionary: a backbone. This internal skeleton of cartilage and bone provided structural support that was far more versatile than the external armor of arthropods or the rigid shells of mollusks. A backbone could grow with the organism, could be modified for different functions, and could support much larger body sizes than had ever been possible before. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes because it saw an extraordinary diversification of vertebrate life in marine environments. Placoderms, those heavily armored fish, grew to enormous sizes, some reaching lengths of over 10 meters, making them the largest predators in Devonian seas. Their powerful jaws, lined with sharp bony plates rather than teeth, could crush through the shells of even the most well-protected prey. But the most important developments of this period were happening in the shallow, oxygen-poor waters near ancient coastlines. Some fish were dealing with environments where the water occasionally became too stagnant to support life through gill breathing alone. These fish began to develop primitive lungs, air-filled sacs that could extract oxygen directly from the atmosphere. Picture these early lungfish surfacing in quiet lagoons and slow-moving rivers, gulping air at the surface before diving back down to the bottom. This wasn't just an emergency adaptation. It was opening up an entirely new way of life. Fish with lungs could exploit habitats that were inaccessible to their gill-breathing relatives. As these fish spent more time in shallow waters, some lineages began to develop another crucial innovation: limb-like fins. Instead of the simple paddle-like fins of most fish, these creatures evolved fins with internal bone structures that could support weight and provide leverage for movement. Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada, represents one of the most important transitional forms in vertebrate evolution. This remarkable creature was clearly a fish. It had scales, gills, and fin rays, but it also had features that were clearly adapted for life in shallow water, and possibly even brief excursions onto land. Its fins contained robust bones arranged in a pattern strikingly similar to the arm and hand bones of terrestrial vertebrates. The evolution of limbs was driven by the practical challenges of life in very shallow water. When water levels dropped during dry seasons, fish with strong, limb-like fins could push themselves from one pool to another, or even travel short distances over land to find deeper water. What began as an adaptation for aquatic life gradually became the foundation for terrestrial locomotion. The transition from fins to limbs involved remarkable changes in bone structure and muscle arrangement. The single bone, two bone, many bone pattern that characterizes all vertebrate limbs, from fish fins to bird wings to your own arms, was established during this period. This basic architectural plan proved so successful that it has been conserved for over 400 million years. As some fish lineages spent more time on land, they faced all the same challenges that early plants and arthropods had encountered: desiccation, temperature extremes, gravity, and the need to breathe air rather than water. But vertebrates brought unique solutions to these problems. Their internal skeleton provided excellent structural support for terrestrial life. Unlike arthropods, which were limited in size by their external skeletons, vertebrates could grow much larger while maintaining structural integrity. Their skin could be modified with scales, mucus, and eventually more sophisticated protective barriers. Most importantly, vertebrates had already evolved complex nervous systems and sophisticated sensory organs in aquatic environments. These systems could be modified for terrestrial use, giving early vertebrates advantages in navigation, hunting, and avoiding predators that would serve them well on land. The early tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, were still quite aquatic in their lifestyles. Acanthostega had 8 digits on each limb and internal gills, suggesting it was primarily aquatic despite having limbs. Ichthyostega could probably move on land, but was still dependent on water for reproduction and probably for most of its feeding. These transitional forms reveal that the evolution of terrestrial vertebrates was a gradual process, not a sudden leap from water to land. Different lineages experimented with different combinations of aquatic and terrestrial adaptations, and many retained strong ties to aquatic environments, even as they developed the ability to survive on land. The reproductive challenges of terrestrial life were particularly significant for vertebrates. Unlike plants, which could develop seeds, or arthropods, which could lay protected eggs, early vertebrates were still tied to water for reproduction. Their eggs lacked protective shells and would quickly dry out on land, but even this challenge would eventually be overcome. Some vertebrate lineages evolved the amniotic egg, a remarkable innovation that enclosed the developing embryo in protective membranes and provided it with its own private aquatic environment. This freed vertebrates from the need to return to water for reproduction and opened up the truly terrestrial environments of the planet's interior. The diversification of early tetrapods led to the evolution of the major vertebrate groups that would dominate terrestrial ecosystems. Some lineages remained primarily aquatic, but developed more sophisticated adaptations for swimming and feeding in aquatic environments. Others committed fully to terrestrial life and began to explore the vast ecological opportunities available on land. The evolution of vertebrate jaws also underwent major innovations during this period. Early vertebrates had relatively simple feeding mechanisms, but the demands of terrestrial life led to the evolution of more sophisticated jaw structures that could handle a wider variety of food types. Sensory systems became increasingly important as vertebrates adapted to terrestrial environments. Vision had to be modified for seeing through air rather than water. Hearing systems evolved to detect airborne vibrations. Chemical senses had to adapt to detecting molecules in air rather than water. And here you are tonight, your entire body playing a testament to those ancient innovations of early vertebrates. The backbone that supports you as you lie comfortably in bed is a direct descendant of those first vertebral columns that evolved in primitive fish 400 million years ago. Your limbs follow exactly the same architectural plan as those early tetrapods. 1 bone in the upper arm, 2 bones in the forearm, many bones in the hand. Your lungs use the same basic design as those first air-breathing fish that gulped oxygen at the surface of ancient lagoons. Your complex nervous system, your sophisticated sensory organs, your internal skeleton that can grow and repair itself. All of these trace their origins back to innovations that first appeared in those transitional fish-like ancestors that learned to live between water and land. As vertebrates established themselves on land, as they diversified into new ecological roles and explored new environments, they were setting the stage for one of evolution's most remarkable developments. These early tetrapods would eventually give rise to lineages that would develop something unprecedented in the history of life. Complex, sophisticated brains capable of advanced cognition, memory, and eventually consciousness itself. In the expanding forests of the ancient continents, brains were beginning to grow. In the expanding forests of the ancient continents, brains were beginning to grow in ways they never had before. Let's drift into this profound chapter when neural networks learned to create something entirely new in the universe, the inner world of thought, memory, and consciousness. While dinosaurs ruled the land with their impressive size and power, small furry creatures were hiding in the shadows, developing something far more revolutionary than sharp teeth or powerful limbs. These early mammals, most no larger than modern shrews, were experimenting with an innovation that would eventually reshape the entire planet: sophisticated intelligence. The mammalian brain was unlike anything that had evolved before. While reptilian brains were efficient control systems for basic behaviors, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproducing, mammalian brains added entirely new capabilities. They developed enlarged cerebral cortices, regions of neural tissue that could process complex information, form detailed memories, and engage in what we might recognize as genuine thinking. Picture these early mammals as tiny pioneers of consciousness, scurrying through the undergrowth of Mesozoic forests with brains that were creating internal models of their world. Unlike their reptilian contemporaries, which relied primarily on instinctive responses to stimuli, mammals could learn from experience, remember complex spatial relationships, and even plan ahead for future events. The evolution of sophisticated mammalian intelligence was driven by several unique challenges. First, mammals had evolved endothermic metabolism. They were warm-blooded, maintaining constant body temperatures regardless of environmental conditions. This required precise regulation of energy intake and expenditure, which in turn demanded more sophisticated behavioral control than cold-blooded animals needed. Second, most early mammals were nocturnal, active during the hours when their dinosaur predators were less active. Navigating in darkness required enhanced sensory processing and spatial memory capabilities. They needed to remember the locations of food sources, safe hiding places, and potential threats across complex three-dimensional environments. Third, mammals had evolved a unique reproductive strategy that involved extended parental care. Unlike reptiles, which typically laid eggs and left their young to fend for themselves, mammals nursed their young with milk and often provided protection and teaching for extended periods. This social complexity required new types of cognitive abilities for recognizing individuals, maintaining social bonds, and transmitting learned behaviors across generations. The mammalian brain responded to these challenges by developing several key innovations. The neocortex, a layered structure of neural tissue, became the computational center for complex information processing. Different regions specialized in different types of processing, some for sensory integration, others for motor control, still others for memory formation and retrieval. The hippocampus evolved as a sophisticated navigation and memory system, allowing mammals to create detailed cognitive maps of their environments. These weren't just simple stimulus-response associations, but rich, three-dimensional models that could be manipulated mentally. A mammal could remember not just where food was located, but how to get there from multiple starting points, which routes were safest, and when the food was most likely to be available. The limbic system developed as an emotional processing center that could assign subjective values to experiences. This wasn't just primitive pleasure and pain, but complex emotional states that could guide decision-making in sophisticated ways. Fear could be modulated by context, curiosity could override caution, and social bonds could motivate behaviors that might not be immediately beneficial to the individual. Perhaps most remarkably, mammalian brains began to exhibit the first clear evidence of what we might call consciousness, subjective, first-person experiences of sensory input, emotional states, and internal mental processes. These early mammals weren't just responding to their environments. They were experiencing them in ways that created rich inner lives. Sleep became a crucial component of mammalian intelligence. While all animals had rest periods, mammals evolved complex sleep cycles that included periods of rapid eye movement, REM sleep, during which the brain appears to consolidate memories and process emotional experiences. Dreams, those mysterious internal narratives that fill your sleep tonight, may have first emerged in these early mammals as a way of rehearsing important behaviors and integrating daily experiences. Social intelligence also began to develop during this period. Many mammalian lineages evolved pack behaviors, cooperative hunting strategies, and complex communication systems. They could recognize individual group members, remember past interactions, and maintain social hierarchies based on more than just immediate dominance displays. The sensory systems of mammals became incredibly sophisticated. Their hearing evolved to detect subtle differences in sound frequency and location. Their sense of smell developed into a rich chemical communication system that could convey detailed information about identity, emotional state, reproductive status, and recent activities. Some mammals even evolved echolocation, using sound to create detailed mental maps of their environments. Tool use began to emerge in some mammalian lineages. While not as sophisticated as the tool use that would later evolve in primates, early mammals showed evidence of using objects in their environment to solve problems, using rocks to crack open nuts, using sticks to extract insects from crevices, using leaves to absorb water. Language-like communication systems also began to develop. While not as complex as human language, many mammals evolved sophisticated vocal repertoires that could convey specific types of information. They developed alarm calls that could distinguish between different types of threats, contact calls that could maintain group cohesion across distances, and social calls that could establish and maintain relationships. The development of play behavior was another crucial innovation. Mammalian young began to engage in activities that served no immediate survival function, but appeared to be training for adult behaviors. Play allowed for safe experimentation with hunting techniques, social interactions, and problem-solving strategies. It was perhaps the first time in Earth's history that organisms engaged in behavior purely for the sake of enjoyment and learning. As mammalian intelligence continued to evolve, it began to show the first signs of cultural transmission, the passing of learned behaviors from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation rather than genetic inheritance. Young mammals could learn from their parents not just through instinct, but through observation and practice. The cognitive abilities of mammals also began to include rudimentary forms of abstract thinking. They could categorize objects and experiences, recognize patterns across different contexts, and even show evidence of numerical concepts, distinguishing between different quantities of objects or events. Memory systems became increasingly sophisticated, with mammals developing both short-term working memory for immediate problem-solving and long-term episodic memory for specific experiences. They could remember not just what happened, but when and where it happened, creating the foundation for what psychologists call autobiographical memory. And here you are tonight, your brain a magnificent elaboration of those early mammalian innovations. The neocortex that processes your thoughts, the hippocampus that forms your memories, the limbic system that generates your emotions. All of these are sophisticated versions of neural structures that first evolved in small, nocturnal mammals 200 million years ago. Your ability to dream, to plan for the future, to maintain complex social relationships, to use language, to engage in abstract thinking, all of these trace their origins back to the cognitive innovations that emerged when early mammals were developing new ways of navigating their complex world. Even your sleep cycles, your emotional responses, your capacity for learning and memory, they all use neural circuits and biochemical systems that were first developed when your mammalian ancestors were hiding in the shadows of the dinosaur age, quietly revolutionizing what it means to be conscious. As mammalian intelligence continued to evolve and diversify, as different lineages explored different cognitive niches and developed increasingly sophisticated mental abilities, one particular group of mammals was about to take these innovations to extraordinary new heights. In the forests and savannas of the emerging world, primates were beginning to develop the cognitive abilities that would eventually lead to something unprecedented, the emergence of human consciousness and self-awareness. In the ancient forests, primates were reaching for something new. In the ancient forests and savannas of Africa, primates were reaching for something that had never existed before in the known universe. Let's drift into this most profound chapter, when consciousness learned to examine itself and the cosmos began to know that it existed. Around 200,000 years ago, in the warm grasslands and scattered woodlands of ancient Africa, something unprecedented was stirring in the neural networks of certain primates. The mammalian brain, which had been evolving sophisticated intelligence for millions of years, was about to cross a threshold that would fundamentally change the nature of existence on Earth. These early humans, your direct ancestors, possessed brains that were not just intelligent, but self-aware. For the first time in the 4 billion-year history of life, organisms had evolved the ability to think about their own thinking, to be conscious of their own consciousness, to wonder about their place in the vast cosmos that surrounded them. Picture these early humans gathering around fires in the African twilight, their faces illuminated by flickering flames as they engaged in something that no other species had ever done. They were telling stories, not just sharing information about where food could be found or warning about dangers, but creating narratives about the past, imagining possibilities for the future, and wondering about the meaning of their existence. The evolution of human consciousness involved several revolutionary cognitive innovations. Language became far more sophisticated than the communication systems of other animals. Humans developed the ability to use symbols, sounds, gestures, and eventually written marks to represent not just concrete objects and immediate experiences, but abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, and complex relationships between ideas. This symbolic thinking allowed humans to manipulate ideas mentally in ways that had never been possible before. They could consider multiple solutions to problems without having to test each one physically. They could plan for distant future events, imagining scenarios that had never actually occurred. They could contemplate abstract concepts like justice, beauty, love, and meaning. The human brain developed an unprecedented capacity for what scientists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have their own thoughts, feelings, and perspectives that might be different from one's own. This wasn't just recognizing that others had emotions, but understanding that others had entire inner worlds of subjective experience. This cognitive breakthrough enabled entirely new forms of social cooperation. Humans could coordinate complex group activities, not just through immediate communication, but through shared mental models of goals, strategies, and social roles. They could work together toward objectives that might take years to achieve, with each individual understanding how their actions contributed to collective purposes. Art emerged as humans began to create objects and experiences purely for their aesthetic and symbolic value. The earliest cave paintings, jewelry, and decorative artifacts reveal minds that were capable of appreciating beauty, expressing emotions, and communicating complex ideas through visual symbols. These weren't just practical tools, they were expressions of inner experience. Religion and spirituality also emerged as humans developed the cognitive capacity to contemplate questions that had no immediate practical answers. They began to wonder about the nature of existence itself, about what happened after death, about whether there were unseen forces or consciousnesses that influenced the world around them. The development of cumulative culture was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of human consciousness. Unlike other animals, which might transmit simple learned behaviors across generations, humans could build upon the knowledge and innovations of previous generations. Each generation could add to the collective store of human knowledge, leading to accelerating technological and cultural development. Tool-making became increasingly sophisticated as humans developed the ability to visualize complex, multi-step manufacturing processes. They could envision a finished tool and work backward through all the steps necessary to create it from raw materials. They could improve upon existing designs by imagining modifications and testing them mentally before committing to physical construction. Mathematics and logical reasoning emerged as humans developed abstract thinking capabilities. They could recognize patterns and relationships that existed independently of specific physical objects. They could manipulate symbols according to rules that applied universally across different contexts. The human sense of self became remarkably sophisticated. Unlike other animals, which seemed to experience the world from a first-person perspective without necessarily being aware of that perspective, humans developed explicit self-awareness. They could think about themselves as objects, examine their own mental processes, and even imagine how they might appear from other perspectives. Temporal consciousness expanded dramatically. While other animals could remember past events and anticipate immediate future needs, humans developed the ability to place themselves consciously within extended temporal narratives. They could understand their individual lives as stories with beginnings, developments, and eventual endings. They could contemplate their place in historical sequences that extended far beyond their own lifespans. Moral reasoning emerged as humans developed the cognitive capacity to evaluate actions according to abstract principles of right and wrong. They could consider the consequences of behaviors, not just for themselves, but for other individuals and for society as a whole. They could weigh competing values and make decisions based on ethical considerations rather than just immediate self-interest. The human imagination became capable of creating entirely fictional worlds, scenarios that had never existed and might never exist, but which could be explored mentally for entertainment, education, or problem-solving. Stories, myths, and imaginative play allowed humans to experience possibilities beyond the constraints of immediate reality. Scientific thinking began to emerge as humans developed systematic approaches to understanding natural phenomena. They could formulate hypotheses about how the world worked, design ways to test these hypotheses, and modify their understanding based on evidence. This wasn't just practical problem solving. It was the beginning of a conscious quest to understand the fundamental nature of reality. As human consciousness became more sophisticated, it began to grapple with existential questions that no other species had ever contemplated. Humans became aware of their own mortality and began to wonder about the meaning and purpose of existence. They developed concepts of infinity, eternity, and ultimate truth that stretched their cognitive abilities to their limits. The development of written language allowed human consciousness to extend beyond the limitations of individual memory and lifespan. Ideas could be preserved exactly across generations, accumulated in libraries, and shared across vast distances. The collective human mind became something greater than the sum of its individual parts. Philosophy emerged as humans used their sophisticated, reasoning abilities to examine the most fundamental questions of existence. They wondered about the nature of consciousness itself, about the relationship between mind and matter, about whether reality was ultimately knowable, and about humanity's place in the cosmic order. And here you are tonight, your consciousness a direct continuation of that miraculous awakening that began in ancient Africa 200,000 years ago. The very fact that you can contemplate this story, that you can wonder about your own existence, that you can feel connected to ancestors you've never met across vast spans of time, all of this demonstrates the extraordinary legacy of human consciousness. Your ability to imagine alternatives to your current situation, to plan for distant goals, to appreciate beauty, to grapple with moral questions, to create meaning in your life. These are all expressions of cognitive abilities that first emerged when your ancestors began to think about their own thinking. Your sense of self, your autobiographical memory, your capacity for abstract reasoning, your ability to communicate complex ideas through language. All of these trace back to that revolutionary moment when consciousness became self-aware and the universe began to contemplate itself through human minds. As human consciousness continued to develop and spread across the planet, as our ancestors began to form increasingly complex societies and develop new technologies, they were setting the stage for another revolutionary transformation. The individual human mind was about to discover the power of collective intelligence. The birth of civilization was approaching. Across the fertile valleys of the ancient world, humans were gathering. Across the fertile valleys of the ancient world, humans were gathering in ways they never had before, creating something entirely new in the history of consciousness. Let's drift into this transformative chapter, when individual minds learned to merge into collective intelligence and civilization began to flower. For nearly 200,000 years, humans had lived in small nomadic groups, following the rhythms of the natural world as they hunted and gathered across the landscapes of Africa, Asia, and eventually the entire globe. But around 10,000 years ago, some human communities began to experiment with a radically different way of life, one that would transform not just human society, but the entire planet. The agricultural revolution was more than just a change in how humans obtained food. It was a fundamental reorganization of human consciousness and social organization. When humans learned to domesticate plants and animals, they also learned to settle in permanent communities. And this permanence allowed for the accumulation of knowledge, technology, and culture in ways that had never been possible before. Picture the first agricultural settlements nestled in river valleys across the Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, and other regions where humans independently discovered farming. These weren't just larger versions of hunter-gatherer camps. They were entirely new forms of human organization that allowed for unprecedented specialization and cooperation. For the first time in human history, not everyone needed to spend their time directly obtaining food. Some individuals could focus entirely on tool-making, others on construction, still others on art, music, or the development of new technologies. This division of labor unleashed human creativity in ways that nomadic life had never allowed. Writing systems emerged as human communities grew larger and more complex. The need to keep track of agricultural surpluses, trade relationships, and social obligations led to the development of symbols that could represent not just concrete objects, but abstract concepts, numbers, and complex relationships. Writing transformed human consciousness by allowing ideas to exist independently of the minds that conceived them. The development of written language created the first truly external memory systems. Knowledge could now be preserved exactly across generations, accumulated in libraries, and shared across vast distances without degradation. The collective human mind became something immeasurably greater than the sum of its individual parts. Mathematics evolved from simple counting systems to sophisticated abstract reasoning about quantities, relationships, and patterns. Humans developed the ability to manipulate symbols according to precise rules, opening up entirely new realms of knowledge about the fundamental structures of reality. Architecture became both an art and a science as humans learned to construct permanent structures that could shelter large communities and serve complex social functions. The great pyramids, temples, and early cities weren't just practical constructions. They were expressions of human consciousness working at scales that had never been achieved before. Trade networks began to span continents, connecting human communities that had never directly encountered each other. Ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations could now spread across the entire human population, accelerating the pace of cultural evolution dramatically. Social institutions became increasingly sophisticated as human communities grew larger and more complex. Legal systems, educational institutions, religious organizations, and governmental structures emerged to coordinate the activities of thousands or even millions of individuals working toward common purposes. Science began to emerge as humans applied their reasoning abilities systematically to understanding natural phenomena. Instead of simply accepting traditional explanations for natural events, some individuals began to observe carefully, form hypotheses, and test their ideas against evidence. This marked the beginning of humanity's conscious quest to understand the fundamental laws that govern the universe. Philosophy reached new levels of sophistication as human thinkers had the leisure and security to contemplate abstract questions about the nature of existence, knowledge, ethics, and meaning. The great philosophical traditions that emerged during this period provided frameworks for thinking about questions that are still central to human consciousness today. Art and literature flourished as human consciousness found new ways to express its inner experiences and explore imaginary worlds. Epic poems, sculptures, paintings, and musical compositions created shared cultural experiences that could unite entire civilizations around common values and narratives. Technology began to accelerate at an unprecedented pace as human inventors could build upon the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. The development of metallurgy, engineering, navigation, and countless other technologies gave humans increasing control over their environment and expanded the range of possibilities for human life. Religious and spiritual traditions became more elaborate as human consciousness grappled with existential questions on a civilizational scale. The great world religions that emerged during this period provided comprehensive frameworks for understanding humanity's place in the cosmos and for organizing societies around shared values and purposes. Education became formalized as human communities recognized the need to transmit their accumulated knowledge and skills to new generations. Schools, universities, and other educational institutions emerged to ensure that the cultural achievements of each generation would not be lost. The development of complex societies also led to new forms of human cooperation and competition. Different civilizations developed distinct approaches to organizing human life, leading to cultural diversity that enriched the global pool of human knowledge and experience. As civilizations became more sophisticated, they began to pose new challenges for human consciousness. The individual human mind, which had evolved for life in small groups, had to adapt to existence in complex societies with millions of members. New forms of identity, social organization, and meaning-making evolved to help humans navigate these unprecedented social environments. The pace of change itself became a new factor in human experience. While traditional societies had changed slowly over many generations, civilized societies began to experience significant transformations within individual lifetimes. Humans had to develop new cognitive strategies for adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. Recorded history began as humans developed the ability to document not just practical information, but narratives about past events, genealogies of rulers, and accounts of significant cultural developments. For the first time, human consciousness could place itself consciously within extended historical narratives. The development of formal logic and systematic reasoning created new tools for human thinking. Philosophers and scientists developed methods for evaluating arguments, identifying fallacies, and reaching reliable conclusions based on evidence and reasoning. As human civilizations continued to grow and develop, they began to encounter fundamental questions about sustainability, justice, and the long-term future of human society. These challenges required new forms of collective intelligence and cooperation that stretched human consciousness in directions it had never explored before. And here you are tonight, living within the vast networks of knowledge, technology, and culture that have been accumulating for 10,000 years of human civilization. The language you think in, the concepts you use to understand the world, the technologies that surround you, all of these are products of countless generations of human minds working together to expand the boundaries of what consciousness can achieve. Your education, your ability to read and write, your access to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization through books and digital media. These connect you directly to those first agricultural communities that began the great experiment of civilized life. Even your individual consciousness has been shaped by thousands of years of cultural evolution. The way you think about yourself, your relationships, your place in the world, these are all influenced by philosophical, religious, and scientific traditions that stretch back to the earliest civilizations. As human civilization continued to develop and spread across the planet, as our collective knowledge and technological capabilities grew ever more sophisticated, humanity was approaching one of its most profound intellectual achievements. We were about to discover something that would fundamentally change our understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos. We were about to discover our own evolutionary history. In the libraries and laboratories of the modern world, human consciousness was about to achieve something unprecedented, the ability to understand its own cosmic story. Let's drift into this remarkable chapter when the universe finally began to comprehend its own 4-billion-year journey to awareness. For most of human history, the origins of life and consciousness remained mysterious. Despite their sophisticated intelligence, humans could only speculate about where they had come from, how life had begun, and what their relationship was to the other creatures that shared the planet. But beginning around 200 years ago, human consciousness began to piece together the most profound story ever told, the story of its own emergence from the cosmic deep. The first clues came from the rocks themselves. Geologists began to recognize that the Earth was far older than anyone had imagined, and that its layers contained a record of ancient life forms unlike anything living today. Fossils revealed creatures had seemed to bridge the gaps between different types of modern organisms, suggesting that life forms had changed dramatically over vast periods of time. Charles Darwin's revolutionary insight was to recognize that these changes weren't random, but followed a pattern that could be understood through natural processes. The mechanism of natural selection, the survival and reproduction of organisms best adapted to their environments, could explain how simple life forms could gradually give rise to complex ones over millions of years. Picture Darwin himself, walking the paths of his estate, contemplating the implications of his theory. He was realizing that human consciousness, the very capacity for thought that allowed him to understand evolution, was itself a product of the evolutionary process. The mind studying evolution was evolution studying itself. As the 19th and 20th centuries progressed, human understanding of life's history became increasingly detailed and comprehensive. Paleontologists discovered fossil evidence for the major transitions in evolutionary history, from simple cells to complex ones, from marine life to terrestrial, from simple multicellular organisms to complex animals with sophisticated nervous systems. The discovery of DNA in the 20th century revolutionized our understanding of evolution by revealing the molecular mechanisms that make inheritance and variation possible. For the first time, humans could see exactly how genetic information was stored, copied, and modified across generations. The genetic code turned out to be universal, the same basic system used by bacteria, plants, animals, and humans alike. Molecular biology revealed that all life on Earth shares common ancestry. The proteins that carry out essential functions in human cells are remarkably similar to those in bacteria, plants, and other animals. This wasn't just superficial resemblance. It was evidence of literal kinship stretching back billions of years. The development of radiometric dating techniques allowed scientists to put precise ages on evolutionary events. Rocks could be dated directly, and the fossils they contained could be placed within an accurate temporal framework. For the first time, humans could construct a detailed timeline of life's history on Earth. Modern evolutionary biology revealed the extraordinary sophistication of even the simplest living systems. The more scientists learned about cellular biochemistry, molecular genetics, and developmental biology, the more remarkable the evolutionary process appeared. Life had not only survived for billions of years, but had created innovations of staggering complexity and elegance. The discovery of the antiquity of the universe itself, through astronomy and cosmology, placed biological evolution within an even grander context. Humans learned that the atoms in their bodies had been forged in the cores of ancient stars, that the solar system had formed from the debris of stellar explosions, and that the entire universe had been evolving and complexifying for nearly 14 billion years. Neuroscience began to reveal how consciousness itself had evolved. The human brain could be understood as an elaborate elaboration of neural structures that first appeared in simple animals hundreds of millions of years ago. Consciousness wasn't separate from the physical world. It was the universe, becoming aware of itself through the evolution of sufficiently complex information processing systems. The synthesis of evolution with genetics, molecular biology, developmental biology, and neuroscience created a comprehensive understanding of life that was both scientifically rigorous and profoundly meaningful. Humans could now trace their lineage back through every major transition in the history of life on Earth. This scientific understanding had profound implications for human consciousness and culture. Humans began to see themselves not as separate from nature, but as part of an unbroken continuum of life, stretching back to the very origins of biology. Every aspect of human existence, physical, mental, emotional, social, could be understood as products of evolutionary processes. The environmental movement emerged partly from this evolutionary understanding. Recognizing their kinship with all life on Earth, many humans began to feel a responsibility to protect the ecosystems and species that shared their evolutionary heritage. Conservation became not just practical necessity, but moral imperative. Modern medicine was revolutionized by evolutionary thinking. Understanding human anatomy and physiology as products of evolutionary history helped doctors understand why bodies function as they do, why certain diseases affect humans, and how medical interventions could work with, rather than against, evolved biological systems. Psychology and anthropology were transformed by evolutionary perspectives. Human behavior, emotions, social structures, and cultural patterns could all be understood as products of evolutionary processes operating over different timescales, some biological, some cultural, some technological. The pace of scientific discovery accelerated dramatically as human consciousness developed. Increasingly sophisticated tools for studying the natural world. Electron microscopes revealed the intricate structures of cells. Space telescopes showed the evolution of galaxies, and computers allowed for complex modeling of evolutionary processes. As human understanding of evolution became more complete, it began to reshape fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Evolution revealed that consciousness wasn't separate from the physical universe, but was the way the universe had learned to experience and understand itself. The story of evolution also revealed the incredible improbability and preciousness of consciousness. The sequence of events that led from the first simple cells to self-aware beings capable of contemplating their own existence involved countless contingencies and near extinctions. Human consciousness represented not just an outcome of evolution, but perhaps its most remarkable achievement. Modern humans began to see themselves as evolution, becoming conscious of itself. Through human minds, the universe could now contemplate its own history, understand its own processes, and even influence its own future development. This was not just scientific knowledge, it was a form of cosmic awakening. The implications of evolutionary understanding continue to unfold today. Humans are beginning to recognize that they are not just products of evolution, but have become active participants in evolutionary processes. Through technology, medicine, genetic engineering, and environmental management, human consciousness is now influencing the future direction of life on Earth. And here you are tonight, perhaps the first generation of humans to fully understand your own cosmic origins. You know that every atom in your body was forged in stellar cores, that every cell in your body shares ancestry with all other life on Earth, that your consciousness is the result of 4 billion years of patient evolutionary experimentation. This knowledge transforms what it means to be human. You are not just an individual living in the present moment. You are evolution's way of looking back on its own history and forward to its possible futures. Your capacity to understand this story is itself part of the story, the moment when the universe achieved self-awareness. Your DNA carries the molecular signatures of every major transition in evolutionary history. Your brain uses neural circuits that first evolved in ancient fish. Your capacity for consciousness represents the culmination of the longest and most complex developmental process in the known universe. And so we arrive at the present moment, at the end of our cosmic journey through deep time. 4 billion years of patient evolution, countless generations of ancestors who survived against impossible odds, and now ... here you are. And here you are, the present moment. And here you are, lying peacefully in this present moment, the latest chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. You are not just the end result of 4 billion years of evolution. You are evolution's way of experiencing consciousness, of feeling wonder, of contemplating the very journey that created you. Think about this for a moment. Every breath you take connects you to those first cyanobacteria that learned to photosynthesize in ancient seas. The oxygen flowing through your bloodstream was first produced by organisms, so simple they were barely more than chemical reactions. Yet they transformed the entire planet to make your existence possible. Every heartbeat is powered by mitochondria that were once free-living bacteria, now so integrated into your cells that they are part of you. Your ability to move, to think, to dream. It all depends on this ancient partnership between different forms of life that learned to cooperate billions of years ago. Your DNA carries within it the accumulated wisdom of 4 billion years of survival. Every nucleotide in your genetic code has been tested by natural selection across countless generations. You are literally made of information that has been refined by the longest and most rigorous quality control process in the known universe. Your brain, with its 100 billion neurons and trillions of connections, represents the most complex structure that has ever emerged from evolutionary processes. The thoughts flowing through your mind tonight are the universe becoming conscious of itself, matter organizing itself in such intricate ways that it can contemplate its own existence. Your capacity to feel emotions, love, wonder, contentment, curiosity, these are not separate from your evolutionary heritage, but expressions of it. The neural circuits that generate your feelings evolved because they helped your ancestors survive, reproduce, and cooperate. Your ability to feel connected to other people, to find meaning in existence, to appreciate beauty, these are all gifts from the deep evolutionary past. Even your sleep, which is gently embracing you now, connects you to that ancient rhythm that was first established when early mammals learned to process experiences and consolidate memories during periods of rest. Your dreams tonight will use the same basic neural processes that evolved when consciousness first began to create internal models of reality. You are simultaneously utterly unique, a genetic and experiential combination that has never existed before and will never exist again, and yet fundamentally connected to every living thing on Earth. The same basic cellular machinery that keeps you alive is operating in bacteria, plants, and animals across the planet. You are part of an unbroken chain of life that stretches back to the very origins of biology. In the vast scales of cosmic time, your individual lifetime is just a brief moment. But what a moment it is! You are the universe's way of experiencing consciousness, of feeling wonder, of asking questions about existence itself. Through your awareness, 4 billion years of patient evolution achieves its goal of understanding itself. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the end of our gentle journey through deep time. We've drifted together across 4 billion years, from the first stirrings of chemistry in ancient seas to this moment of consciousness contemplating its own cosmic origins. We've discovered that you are not separate from this vast story of evolution. You are its culmination, its current expression, its way of becoming aware of itself. Along the way, we've seen that evolution is not just a biological process, but a cosmic one. From the formation of the first complex molecules to the emergence of self-aware consciousness, the universe has been engaged in an extraordinary, creative project of which you are the most recent and most remarkable achievement. So let me ask you once more, gently as I did at the start, where are you listening from tonight? And do you feel, as I do, the profound beauty of your connection to this 4 billion year story? You are evolution's dream of consciousness, matter's achievement of self-awareness, the universe's way of contemplating its own magnificent history. If you found any peace or wonder in this quiet expedition through deep time, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd like the video. Maybe subscribe and share this cosmic lullaby with someone else who might need reminding of how extraordinary their existence truly is. The vast story of evolution continues through you, in you, and because of you. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every moment of consciousness you experience is the universe, celebrating its own incredible journey from nothing to everything to awareness itself. Sleep well, fellow traveler through time, wherever and whenever you are. You carry within yourself the memory of 4 billion years of patient evolution. And tomorrow, you'll continue writing the next chapter of the most beautiful story ever told.